Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. As many of you know, I'm a real estate investor, so I spend a lot of time looking at real estate markets and data to see what's going on in the rental market and all that great stuff. And I recently came across some interesting data about who landlords actually are. That is, who actually runs rental properties. Is it large corporations? Is it individuals? Let's take a look at what the 2018 Rental Housing Finance Survey said. And this is a survey that's conducted, I guess, every couple of years. The next one is slated to actually post this year in 2021. They're collecting all the data for it now. So this is a couple years old technically, but I imagine the data isn't very different. And this is from an article from the National Association of Realtors going over the actual rental housing survey. You can see the headline here is that mom and pop landlords manage 77% of 2 to 4 unit properties, but that in itself, it doesn't tell you the whole story. So let's go down and take a look at some of this data. You can see that 48% of rental units are in properties with 1 to 4 units. So about half of all rental properties are very small 1 to 4 unit buildings. I live in Chicago, which I think is at least slightly famous for having many smaller multifamily units throughout the city. So lots of duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, mainly duplexes. But obviously as you move out, there's plenty of single family homes. And then you get in the suburbs, it's pretty much all single family homes, but you're going to find that in a lot of major American markets. But anyways, you can see the actual distribution of the number of units within properties by number of units on the property. That is, what percentage of the rental housing supply is in this type of property. So about 35% of the rental housing supply are single family homes, so 1 unit. I'm not sure if condos would be counted here. They probably would be. So I guess you could probably lump condos in as a single unit, even though it's in a larger building. But then you still have a pretty large portion here, about 13% of 2 to 4 unit buildings. So 1 to 4 units is looking at about 48% of the housing supply, as they say here. 48% of rental units are in properties with 1 to 4 units. But that leaves a majority of the remaining rental supply in larger buildings, so 5 to 150 plus units, with a third of the units or so being in 150 unit buildings or more, or complexes more like it. And I suppose that makes sense because of economies of scale, but I find it interesting that there's this divergence between 1 and 150 plus units. You might normally expect more in this middle range perhaps, but just because of the way the US has been suburbanized, there's so many single family homes that I think really drag this distribution to both tails. And then often it's not very profitable to build many of these sort of mid-sized developments because you either can't build them because it's not zoned for that, or you have such little space that it makes sense to go as dense as possible because otherwise you're in a single family district. Lots of different zoning issues within the US since it's skewed so heavily towards single family homes, but that's kind of beside the point of this video. But you could just see that many of the units, about half, are 1 to 4 units, and the rest are larger complexes, with the rest of that remaining half being over 150 unit complexes. Moving on down, we could see that 41% of rental properties are owned by individuals. This is what I was actually researching. I wanted to see how many buildings and rental units are actually owned by large corporations or REITs, and it's actually a very small fraction of rental properties. Granted, this doesn't break it down by units, as I'm sure not many individuals own 150 units or more. This is probably big conglomerates, REITs, pension funds that own these buildings. So each corporation or REIT like that, it's going to have a much higher average number of units under it. So you're not getting that granular data here, but you could still see just by the property alone, if you count a 1 unit property as 1 property, or a 50 unit property as 1 property, if we're just doing that, just counting like that, then many of the actual properties are owned by individuals, not by corporations, and not even by LLCs or LLPs. As you can see here, this is what that category is. It's LLP, LP, or LLC. So technically the property that I own in Indianapolis, that's owned in an LLC, but it's not really a corporation. It's more of an entity that my wife and I use to own the property, and we treat it like a business, of course, but it's kind of hard to call it a corporation. You're not going to lump it in with a REIT. So I'd imagine a large portion of this section is also individuals, or people who set up an LLC and they run their rental business like a business in an LLC, but they're still individuals running it. It's not like a huge team or something like that. That's kind of what I'm getting at there. But still, a large portion of the 1 to 4 units, which is the near majority of the housing supply, are owned by individuals, which is very interesting. And as you move up in unit size on the property, you see more REIT ownership, but still 5%, or really 6%, and 5% to real estate corporations. So lump that together, that's 10%. That would be probably larger entities. And I'm sure there's a lot of LLCs in here that are pretty large operations with big teams, but it's hard to say since you can have a single member LLC or you can have a large team under it. They're very flexible entities, so it doesn't give you a lot to to go off of there. But still, you see this general trend. Many of the small properties are owned by individuals, and that's the majority of properties, or about half. And then as you go up, you see more entity structures and more corporations coming into the mix. But along that same line, we have 42% of rental properties run day to day by the owners, so self-managed properties. And that makes sense. Individuals typically don't own a ton of extra units. I saw a stat somewhere, I don't think it was in this article, but the vast majority of individual landlords just own one other property. And I think that's because a lot of the time it's people who maybe moved out of their previous home and just decided to keep it and bought a new one. So now they own two properties, one as a rental. That seems like a very common thing that could happen over a lifetime. If you bought a home maybe in your 30s and then 10 years later, 15 years later, you want to move somewhere else and you decide to keep the home as a rental, I think that'd be a very sort of easy thing to fall into becoming a landlord if you already had the property. But then I'm sure you also have a large number of others who intentionally buy a rental property just as a rental purpose. That's what we did. We bought a single family home in Indianapolis, hold that as a rental. And that was our intention the whole time. We had no intention of living in it, and we treat it like a rental business because that's what it is. Now, we don't manage it ourselves. We give it to a property manager, but a little bit less than half of rental property owners run it day to day themselves. I'm sure corporations do not. They have property management teams, so it's not a self-managed mom and pop type thing. That's what they're designating it as, mom and pop landlords. That would be landlords who actually manage it themselves. And following the same distribution as before, the ones with the higher individual ownership, 1 to 4 units, also have the largest share of those units being managed by individuals, by the individual owners. So not very surprising there. The smaller the property, the more likely it's owned by an individual, and the more likely it's owned by an individual, the more likely they are actually managing that property themselves. But about 20% of single family units and also of 2 to 4 units are managed professionally by a management company or by an agent directly employed by the person who owns it. So not a secondary company, but they're actually a direct employee. And I'm not sure what this other category would be, management other. I'm not sure really what that would mean. I don't know what else you could have besides managing yourself or paying someone else to manage it for you. And that's what these two categories are. So I don't know what that is. So knowing what we already know, I can't say it's too surprising, but definitely interesting to see who's actually managing properties. It's about half individuals who own the property themselves and also manage it themselves, according to the data. And the last stat I'll go over here is this one down here. 59% of properties have a mortgage or similar debt. I'm not sure what other debt you'd want to put on real estate, but I guess you could do a personal loan or something like that and somehow attach it to your real estate, but that's what a mortgage is. So anyways, interestingly, percent of properties with a mortgage or similar debt by number of units, less than half of single unit rentals have a mortgage on them, which I think is very interesting. And I think that adds to my point earlier about it probably being a lot of people who have owned a home for a long time and have moved to a different one, and maybe they've paid down that mortgage, paid it down quickly, or otherwise just held it for a very long time and came to the end of the amortization schedule. So that does make sense, I suppose, if that's what most single family unit landlords are. But as you go up, you see the debt also balloon as well, which is interesting. Since for one, I'd imagine that rates are probably pretty good at these large institutional level deals, and they're often not necessarily as leveraged. They're not going to be 95% leveraged, for example. They might be 65% leveraged since there's limits on commercial sizing of mortgages, generally speaking. So this is a little bit misleading. This isn't to say that 150 unit properties are all leveraged out their ears, though I'm sure there are a number that are. But that's just put that in perspective. This isn't tell you what the loan to value ratio is with these properties, but it just says whether they have a mortgage on them at all or not. And I'll add on this other stat here in the article. Over 16% of tenants received Section 8 assistance in 2017. For those of you who don't know what Section 8 is, it's a voucher program for rental assistance. So it's a form of welfare for housing, basically, is all it is. And clearly it's a significant portion of the rental market, almost 20%. So very significant. And I wonder how much this will change as we approach 2020 data, when we had all of the turmoil in 2020. I'm sure many more people qualified for housing voucher programs, though I think many of these have fixed budgets and you have to qualify for them, and it can be difficult. So I'd be interested to see what happens to the data that we see here in future years. So when we get this next survey coming around this year, I'd imagine it would go up pretty significantly, perhaps up to 20% or above, but we'll see. Certainly there are other housing assistance programs out there. Section 8 is a big and very significant one, clearly very significant. And also significant is that many of the tenants in single family units do not have Section 8 assistance. And I guess it makes sense since single family units tend to be a little bit more expensive than something in a large building, for example, in a 99 unit building. I also find this distribution a little bit odd that of the 25 to 50 units, or really 25 to 100 units, they have a higher percentage of Section 8 tenants than the 150 unit plus buildings. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not really sure what would cause that. Maybe just because a lot of the 25 to 100 unit properties are older, perhaps, in the US because of that zoning thing I mentioned earlier. A lot of single family units have been built more recently and large building complexes, not as many mid-tier size buildings, 25 to 100 units. That could be. So maybe they're just older, and because they're older, they're cheaper, and because they're cheaper, they can actually qualify for rental assistance programs. Just a thought, maybe that's it, but still interesting to note. So that's pretty much all I wanted to go over with this survey. I thought it was interesting. If you found it informative, definitely leave a like, since that would help the channel out a lot. I'll definitely do these sorts of data-focused videos, just seeing what's going on in the rental market or in other financial markets as well, since data can be very useful for helping to fuel investment decisions, and also I think it can be pretty interesting as well. But like I said, definitely like this video, since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about real estate, I put out new videos every single week as they relate to personal finance and investing, so be sure to subscribe so don't miss any new updates, because I put out new videos every single week. But until next time, take care.